Welcome to In Conversation with writer and editor Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life, a monthly chat with writers, publishers, and those who support the literary arts. Today, Sheila is talking with Port Townsend poet Gayle Kaune, whose most recent volume of poems is All the Birds Awake.
Hello, this is Sheila Bender. You're listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, my guest is Port Townsend poet Gayle Kaune. I'd like you to know a little bit about her before we begin talking. She's been widely published in literary magazines, including Poet and Critic, Willow Springs, and the Seattle Review. She has won several Washington Poets Awards, a Ben-Hur Lampman Award, and has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize. Her chapbooks are N. Sid Sends Star and Concentric Circles, which won the Flume Press Award. Her books include Still Life in the Physical World, published by Blue Begonia Press, and her latest book, All the Birds Awake, is available from Tebet Bach. The poet Peggy Schumacher has said of Gayle's poems, "These vivid poems show us ways to live and ways to face the end of living." Gayle is a teacher and is a retired psychotherapist. She's also the co-founder of the Rattlesnake Mountain Writers Workshop and is now on the Centrum Writers Conference Advisory Board here in Port Townsend. She lives with her husband just outside of town in Calla Point. Gayle, welcome.
Thank you, Sheila.
I'm so happy to have you here to be discussing your poems and your career as a poet. Of course, it's very interesting to learn that you're a retired psychotherapist, and so I think I'd like to start by asking you where in your careers, both as psychotherapist and poet, the twain shall meet. How did that happen? How does one feed the other?
Well, that's interesting, Sheila, because when I was getting ready to go back full swing, I'd taught school, and then I stayed home with my kids and was a housewife poet, and then I did a lot of part-time jobs. Then I was ready to get right in there for the working and retirement and college funds. So rather than get an MFA, which I'd already kind of become a poet, I decided that I would get an MSW, which was really interesting to me, and I wanted something that was very flexible and very employable. And I know that a lot of people, there's a journal writing and poets therapy, poetry therapy, and all that, and I really thought the two would feed each other. But the truth is, if you're really immersed in a field intellectually and academically, you can't blur it. I didn't use the poetry in my work at all, except that if people were interested in writing, clients, I'd encourage them to write. I didn't ever feel comfortable using the stories in my poetry.
That's interesting, Gayle. I kind of want to back up to something interesting you said and then come forward again to how you managed to be in two worlds. Every poet needs a day job, it seems, and you had quite a one filled with responsibility. You said you were a housewife poet. Does that mean, I think it means that you were able to write and concentrate on your writing around the raising of children? But it raises the question for me is, how did you plunge in? How did you start writing poetry?
I just want to address the housewife poet thing. I hate that term, but in all honesty, my husband's income did support us. But I'm telling you, I did everything. I was working all the time at part-time jobs and at all of the responsibilities that the poor double working couples now, I don't know how they get it done. How did I start writing poetry? I actually started when I was a young child. So I've always been a poet. My first publication was, I think I was about 7, the big poem, story, and joke book.
That's fabulous.
Published between 2 sheets of blue construction paper. I still have it, and I spelled poem P-O-A-M. And then my next publication was when I was 9, and I sent a poem I wrote into the adult poetry column in the Sunday paper. And what was interesting about that, it was my first incidence, maybe not my first, but it was true, where you self-censor yourself, because I was writing about God, and I didn't want my parents to see that. So I just put my initials in, And to this day, I think my mother would have been really excited to see her daughter have a poem in the adult poetry
Yes.
page, but I didn't want them to know that I even thought about God, because that was kind of a put down by my father.
He was an atheist?
He just thought it was all so silly and ridiculous.
I was going to ask you if you had parental support or some mentor that helped you with poetry and getting it out in the world, but it sounds like you were very self-directed, that you saw there was a poetry column, and then you submitted your work at, did you say age 9?
9.
So this was coming from you, and you, although you might have censored your name, you didn't censor your inclination to write poetry like a lot of us have.
I've always written poetry, and I think part of it, I will say that my mother used to say that we were descended from Hans Christian Andersen, and she used to read poems, so there was a love on her part.
That's excellent.
But I was pretty shy and never showed. My mother would make such a big deal out of it, and my father would be so like, oh my God, what is that? That I was just quiet.
Right. Well, I know when I was reading stories, fiction that I loved as a kid and was very affected by them, my father would say, well, that's just a story. It's not true.
Yes.
And I censored for a long time, my connection to literature. I thought, well, I better become a social worker or a biologist or something that's true rather than write. So I'm very pleased for you that your career started early and you were able to continue.
Well, I didn't major in English in college. I never was thinking of myself as a poet until it was this thing, the housewife poet thing, was when I was home with a new baby. And somebody said they did an anthology. I sent in a poem, and they took this was in Richland. And then there was a group that formed to go over poetry. And so I went to it with my new baby. And that's when I really became a serious, active writer from then on.
And how did that change your life or your poetry, your focus?
Well, it totally changed my life, because then I began to think of myself as a poet, and I have since then. I don't run around and say it. I mean, you kind of have to have, back then you had a life in the regular world. Even when I was a therapist, people that knew me knew I was a poet, but saying you're a poet can sound kind of pretentious, I always thought. So it was just something I always did.
Isn't that sad, though? I think it's absolutely true even today that more and more people will say it, but it is sad that we can't readily identify ourselves as people who keep the word and people who love the word and people who want to say the unsayable on our own behalf as well as the behalf of others who read us. Currently, I'm teaching a class to college students and in writing poetry. And one of the things that really struck me is that they have said how self-indulgent in a good way it has felt to them to be able to write without a template they have to fill, without a teacher's expectations about what they'll say. I think all of us should be poets and identify ourselves that way. Thank you for bringing that up, that we live in a kind of one foot in one world, one in the other, which brings me back to your career as a social worker or a therapist, and or both, it sounds like, with the MSW. Was that difficult? Did you feel that you were shutting one world off in order to be in the other one?
I kind of was. I continued to write, but it's funny because I decided to go back to school and go in another direction career-wise, one that wasn't quite so physically demanding, I thought, as a teacher, where I had some health issues. And then I also turned 50, and I'd had other books, chapbooks come out, but my first trade book came out that year. My last child left home, and I had to take care of my father. He moved up with dementia. So it was quite a milieu. And so during that period, I got up, and I did always write, but I was going to conferences and academic things in my clinical field. So I was really focused on building the career there, and then I presented at some state conferences and things as a psychotherapist, not as a poet.
It's amazing how much a person can get done in a lifetime, isn't it? The poems in your newest book, which is out now, All the Birds Awake, has a beautiful title, which I'd like you to tell me about in a minute. Are these poems written since your retirement, or are they a blend from over the years?
They're mostly poems from the last 10 years, I would say. And Yes, they're from about that period. They're a little different from my first book. They're kind of broader and more expansive. And now I'm starting to write, I think, a shorter poem again. So it's interesting how you go through different periods.
It is. You want to tell us about the title? And then I'd love it if you could read one or two.
Okay. All the Birds Awake is from a line from the title poem, which I won't read because it's a little long and it's a prose poem. But it's about a beautiful day, all the birds awake and singing.
Nice.
It has to do a lot with my writings evolved over the years into different phases, and that's kind of the one I'm in now, where earlier work, my very earliest work, I think was to have a voice. First as a young child, what I thought, whether it was approved by my family or whatever. Then as a woman that, there was a lot of, just before the women's movement going on. And so it was to have a voice about women and their role in life. And they were kind of second-class citizens. And now I'm writing more, I think, about that last phase of life where things can be sad and oppressive, but there's injustices and everything. But I'm at the point in my life where you look for the beauty, and there always is some incredible amount of beauty in the world.
Do you have a poem from the book that you would like to read? Or a newer poem?
Well, I'll read the first poem in the book, which is about my life. I lived in eastern Washington for 25 years, and it's now the most polluted area in the country because of the development of plutonium during the World War. And then also as a child, I lived in Las Vegas, and we used to watch the atomic bomb testing. So these are these places of terror and destruction, but there's beauty in them too. So I'll read this. Hanford Reach. It begins with an epigraph from a U.S. government brochure. This is the Hanford Reach, 51 miles of free-flowing river, land preserved in its purity because of nuclear reactors. Sage sparrows, white pelicans, great blue heron in tree-top rookeries. It's all a prayer to the natural world, as if the sand cliffs known as White Bluffs could erase the outline of plutonium reactors, as if the sky, clean and clear now, could forget the toxic fumes of the green run of 49. I have come here with my family, husband, 2 grown daughters, 50 miles upriver on a jet boat, the roar of the motor silenced as we drift along the cliffs. It's 104 degrees, and with the heat, peace descends on the river. Part 2. War is over, and Jimmy Gladwell leaves recess early because he's crying. I'm back in Vegas, 1955, the morning an A-bomb explodes in the desert, and the boys tell Jimmy he's a sissy because he'd been afraid to get up and cheer. I'd risen at 5 with my family, huddled on the porch in my white gown, waited for the flash, the roar, sunrise on the crimson cloud.
Wow. This is why I think people should not be afraid to say they're poets. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sheila.
So that is a lyric poem. It's a page. And your prose poem that you talk about, is it a paragraph? What does it look like in the book?
Oh, it's quite a long poem, and I don't have the page it's on. It is about being on my back deck with my brother.
As a child?
No, as an adult. It just talks about things going on in the world.
One of the reasons I'm asking you about it is that these days it seems like the line between subgenres is blurring. Prose poem, flash nonfiction, flash fiction. lyric poetry that can have really long lines. And so I've just found it really interesting that you said it was a prose poem and it was really long. And I see that it is looking more like paragraphs on the page. What is the difference to you between writing in that form and writing in the shorter lyric form? And you mentioned you seem to be moving towards the shorter poems again.
Well, when I write the shorter form, I'm just so careful about each line and the beat in each line, the beginning word and the ending words. And so if you just glance, you can see there's just a big difference. The longer, I don't write too many prose poems. This one it just kind of unreeled itself into this longer poem, which I'll just read the first the last stanzas. All the birds awake. It had been a year since his wife died, and now her brother was sitting on her woman's deck, fountain bubbling in the background. The brother leaned forward, answered the woman's questions. How was he? What's happening? All predictable. But the woman thought her brother had changed. He looked tired. Was it weight loss to save his ticking heart? Or was it grief that had painted his face with new lines? And then I go on into describing the world at this time. Remember, there was a jet that had just crashed in the Atlantic. I don't remember that. Michael Jackson had just died. And so I began to describe this. And I was thinking about a trip we went on to Dubrovnik, where that city had been bombed and now it had been rebuilt. And how water, it's a reminiscence. And then the last paragraph says, breakfast dishes lay on the garden table. She tried to skewer the memory of this time, her sweet brother, the sun, all the birds awake and singing, flags being raised for the 4th, the rest of her family coming to visit. Life was like that 14-headed fountain in Dubrovnik. Drink from all the faucets. The world brings you luck.
Thank you. Each one of these, of course, to my ear, sound like a poem. The opening, where you're focusing on his face and coming down to the lines of life, is very stirring. So how poets know what they're writing, like you said, it unreeled itself. Isn't that magic, a kind of magic where the words are leading you and becoming something longer or staying shorter? How do you make those judgments about what you're writing, what it wants to be?
I think it's a matter of intuition and practice. When I first really in college, I didn't take writing or writing workshops. I was a history major. I wrote a lot of papers, but so when I really started writing seriously, I took a lot of workshops, studied with a lot of really well-known poets. I came over to Centrum. It was absolutely critical in my development because I couldn't fly off and get an MSW at that point. So initially I wrote in very strict, it was free verse, but very strict form, iambic pentameter. I'd rewrite something maybe 25, 30 times, changing all the beats and the lines. And then you kind of come to your voice at some point. You kind of come to knowing. And so it is intuitive, and it is what's in your gut, but it's you've done your practice. You've done your scales.
Very nice. And you meant MFA, right? When you said you couldn't get an MFA.
Yes. What did I say?
MSW?
No, that I could get. That was local, and I knew I could get a job. Right. And I knew I could.
Yeah, what are initials anyway at this stage?
I will say now, though, about that MSW, it totally informs my writing now.
How is that?
Because I really spent a lot of time hearing people's stories, learning a lot of personal tragedy and grief, and also a certain witness. You really become a witness to life. So when you're done with it, because I didn't ever want to use the stories that I heard, that seemed kind of symbiotic to me, parasitical. But now it's in my DNA. I kind of learned from that, and I have an understanding from that.
So that's reflected in your poetry and your outlook rather than telling the actual story.
Yes. Yeah. I may get a story from a newspaper, say.
So a lot of compassion and empathy and self-reflection goes into poetry. Do you have any other poem that you'd like to read to us from the earlier book or from now or from All the Birds Awake?
Well, I'm just going to read this poem. I wouldn't say it's my star poem, but it means a lot to me to read it on the air because it's about my dog, who we had for 15 and a half years. And he just passed away 3 weeks ago. So I just like this poem because it's about the tactile thing of a dog. And also, I have to say, I got to read it to him. I read at Centrum summer before last out on the lawn, and my husband brought him there. And when I said the title, he barked, Bathing
Perfect.
Cyrus. With the other dogs, it was a wrestling match, but this one led himself over the edge of the tub into the warm water. Is he ill? I wondered. Then remembered his lineage, show dogs, and all that grooming in his genes. I removed the red collar, his only clothes, and with care spilled water down the white back and legs, tilting his tranquil face toward the light. Washing him, I remembered my long-grown babies, the pleasures of bath time, and the dog stood there, taking it all in, the soaping and rinsing, Mahler on the radio, my fingers rubbing his ears, my lips kissing the top of his wet muzzle, the dirt swirling down the drain, and all the while I'm crooning, good dog, good dog, good dog.
Thank you. It brings tears. It's amazing how our pets hold our lives.
Yes.
You know, they hold so much of our lives. I love the association to bathing your own children and also the lovely image of all the dirt going down the drain. You have this pure moment. Gayle, I love poetry and I love your poetry.
Oh, thank you, Sheila.
Thank you. Are there other things you'd like to tell us about your career or the now of your writing?
Well, I guess I just have always kept writing, and I've found that I want to say a huge word for Centrum because I studied with Marvin Bell, Bill Stafford, Patty Ann Rogers, I wrote these down, David St. John, Primus St. John, Quincy Troop, Peggy Shoemaker, Billy Collins, John Haynes, Paisley Rectal. I was in Eastern Washington, very isolated over there. So I made a big effort to come over here, and it's really played a role in my writing. And I think people go through transitions in their writing, and now I think I've always been interested in the spiritual aspect, as that 9-year-old poem, but now it's even more so. It's a way to kind of get in touch with the mystery and how you have the beauty and the sadness.
Right, the negative capability that we live. For those people who don't know that term, the way I learned it was that John Keats coined that word in a letter about poetry. And he said that poetry succeeds to the extent that it contains negative capability, which is one thing and its opposite. We know our life is ending and our search for the beauty and the mystery increases. Something like that. Do you agree?
Oh, yes. And several poems in this latest book are about the death of a good friend and coming to terms with that.
I had a student write to me today that she doesn't like the last line in her poem, which is about having a brother with Down syndrome who believes that he'll grow up to be all these things, and she carries the burden of knowing. And I thought that was a wonderful phrase, and she wants to take that out of her poem because she wants her poem to be more upbeat and have a silver lining. And I'm trying to communicate to her this thing that we know, which is that poetry is the place where we can show what's true. And I think it's in the showing that the silver lining comes, in our knowing, in our consciousness, as poignant and as sad as it can be, that she knows something he doesn't know. It's also quite beautiful for her to be able to say it. And I feel that quality in your poems, too, and in what you're reaching for right now. And I just want to, like you gave a plug for Centrum, which is fabulous. It's taught so many of us who have been locally able to come and people from afar able to come. Poetry needs that same plug, I think. It's the place where we can speak about the things that are so hard to speak about.
And I think that the beauty there, when you write about these things, is the intimacy that you're sharing with the reader.
Absolutely.
That you come to poetry in a time of pause and a time of reflection. Maybe you're not there when the reader reads it, but in your sharing, there's a beauty. And I think that is what makes poetry so important, that everybody could write. I think it'd be great if everybody were poets and tried to connect and write in that way, because it opens up the world.
Thank you, Gayle. It was beautiful.
Thank you, Sheila. It's great to be here.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman. Production coordinator is Mike Schlexer. Announcer is Kurt Vanderslice.